Okay, thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah. For the invitation, I'm also very glad to be here. It was a very learningful experience already over the past 2 days, especially because there are many policy scientists here. I'm a bit from a different background. I was raised as an aerospace engineer, then moved to social sciences in the field of innovation studies. And that is where I hope my contribution can be from, to add something of an innovation study to the governance discussion. So my field or my talk will be about transport. So in a sense, transport relates to energy because it is a major user of energy. So it's sort of one sector down the line from the energy sector. So basically what I will talk about is I will look to Europe and try to understand the last 25 years about the policies in Europe respecting car use on various levels, European, national, and even lower, maybe. I will draw a conclusion about what the impact of policies have been on the sector, and I will discuss some options for how it could be, some governance options, which is exciting for me because I'm not a governance expert, but it'll be interesting to hear some reactions then. There are quite some links in my talk between other talks that have been done, but hopefully that is interesting. So I think the transport sector is relevant because, as I said, it is a major user of energy. There's been a lot of growth in transport still going on worldwide, but also in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. The number of cars are still growing. And also the share of greenhouse gas emissions of the transport sector is growing in a global perspective, but also in a European perspective. So there have been some decreases in emissions, absolute decreases in some air quality emissions, so degrading air quality, but the greenhouse gas emissions are still growing in their share. So in that sense, it is a relevant sector to look at. So in the last 25 years, there have been various developments in the car sector. Recently, we've been reading and maybe seeing electric vehicles on the road, but in the 1990s, electric vehicles have been introduced. There have been quite some attention for electric vehicles in firms, but also in the governmental level and sponsored projects. There has been a hybrid electric vehicle introduced in 1997 in Japan, after 2000 also in Europe. There have been improvements in traditional gasoline and diesel engines. So there's been a lot of development in the types of cars that are used under influence, especially of governmental policies. So in Europe, there have been a whole series of regulation, especially regarding emissions. So from the 1980s onwards, cars have been required to decrease the level of emissions every about 5 years in a series of regulations. There has been a voluntary agreement on CO2 reductions in Europe, which has not been met greatly and is now being translated in a prohibited scheme. There have been support, subsidies for R&D and also for experiments with fleets of cars in various cities, hydrogen buses or fleets of electric vehicles throughout Europe. And mainly on a national level, there have been various schemes of subsidies for specific types of vehicles. I'm sure also in the country that you are from, there have been subsidy schemes for electric vehicles and for hybrid electric vehicles and maybe for low emission vehicles in general. So the way that we study the innovation in the car use sector is through a socio-technical approach. So more than looking to the technology as such, we try to understand the technology in its social context. And so how we describe either an electric vehicle or a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle also includes the way that the users appreciate or see their vehicle, what their expectations of it are. Also the way that firms have organized their business models around it, and the way they have built up capabilities to build these vehicles, regulations that have been aligned to a specific type of technology. So we wouldn't speak of a dominant product in the sense of an internal combustion engine, but we would speak of a socio-technical regime, because these partly social, partly technical elements are aligned to each other and have built up a sort of stability, and they are rooted in the current practices. So newly introduced technologies are then not just products, but they are socio-technical niches which differ when which can differ from the current order, from the current regime in the industry. And as opposed to the established technology, which have a certain level of stability, niches are often still, socio-technical niches are often still are flexible and changing more fastly. And innovation studies have shown that typically in a sector you will see innovation in a path-dependent way, so it moves with small steps from the established technology that there is, so from the established regime, and does not easily switch to alternative niches. So I think this typology helps to understand the market evolution in the car sector. Typically there is the difference between incremental and radical technologies, which is usually applied to a certain product. But this typology is meant to look at the socio-technical situation in the market, where at the left bottom we see the regime that is established, and usually there is some small innovation in the regime and some small incremental innovation. But on the other hand, there can also be disruptive innovation, and this uses the typology of sustaining and disruptive innovation from Christensen, an innovation business scholar. And when there are niches introduced, this can reorganize the regime, so make a difference, gradual difference in the structure of the regime, but still sustaining it. But if it is a disruptive niche that starts growing, there can be a shift of regime, so a transition. So I think this typology helps to map out different possible scenarios in the sector, because it is a continuum, continuing. A certain trajectory can be sketched into it, and that line would then over time show the pattern in a certain sector. So if we try to do that for the automotive industry in Europe, we will find that there are different interaction effects between newly introduced technologies and the established technology. A typical example of an interaction effect is the market in California, which in the 1990s very enthusiastically put strict regulation towards zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles. In the early 1990s introduced, should have seen a growing market share of electric vehicles from 1996 onwards. But 10 years later, from 1996, we see that the number of electric vehicles on the road was very minimal, but instead another type of technology, a hybrid electric vehicle, was relatively successful, despite a lot of investments, also public investments, in the electric vehicle. So, triggered by the introduction of the electric vehicle and the regulation that triggered it, another technology, a much more relatively less sustainable or at least more emitting type of vehicles was successful or relatively successful. And such types of interactions are more seen in the market. In the Netherlands, for example, there have been a lot of subsidies for the hybrid electric vehicle after 2005, but their market share is relatively little, and there is a great market share for more fuel efficient gasoline and diesel vehicles, and they have a large market share. So triggered by the introduction of the hybrid electric vehicle partly, these established vehicles have become a little bit more fuel efficient, and those have been a great success in the market. Now, most studies tend to focus on one specific technology. So there have been PhDs about the electric vehicle, and then a last chapter about policies to support electric vehicles. Often it is, in certain times in the 1990s, those studies have been done. Around 2000, there was much attention for the hydrogen vehicle. There have been studies on the hydrogen car and chapters about how to promote the hydrogen vehicle, later about biofuels. But there are very few studies who look to the interaction of the different technologies and how they can compete with each other, but also sometimes stimulate each other. And so apart from the classical competition story where one of the two dies, for example, in case of the different types of video standards compete and one of the two becomes the winning one and the other is getting lost. There can also be symbiosis between different types of technologies. And secondly, apart from two sort of equal new technologies competing, we have to do with a situation where one technology is established and rooted very much in our current way of working. So newly introduced technologies have to compete with a very well developed regime in this language. So that means that it will not just be a simple competition with one of the two dying, but it can be a gradual market diversification towards the new niche when the niche starts growing, can trigger a transition in the market. But there can also be a maintenance of the regime where the niche is outcompeted. There can be sort of hybrid products emerging in between, like the hybrid vehicle. So all sorts of patterns can arise in the market. And this is another classical history of hybridization after the introduction of the steamship in the middle of the 19th century, where the steamship was not immediately a success, despite many advantages for going over the oceans without the influence of wind. But it took 40 years before the steamship was a success on the oceans, and in between there were all sorts of improved sailing ships and also these hybrid ships, sailing ships with a little steam engine added to it. So such types of patterns can be sketched in this typology, and they can help also to understand the impact of regulation. Now, and I think this is a pattern that can be seen on the European market over the last 20 years, starting with a well-established, so the slide is not perfect, but I think we can still read it. So that started with a regime of internal combustion engine at the end of the 1980s, an introduced niche of electric vehicles in the 1990s, but not so much success of that niche. But what happened is that elements of electric vehicles were drawn into the regime technology, ICEs, and formed hybrid electric vehicles. And next to that, refined ICEs emerged. And we see especially a growth in those refined ICEs at this moment, sometimes called mild hybrids. So we see a tendency in the sector of sustaining innovation and a behavior away from more disruptive innovation. So overall, the regulations in Europe, I would conclude, supported and also facilitated sustaining innovation. The regulation, especially the emission regulation, emission requirements that were put onto cars, always were sort of small step regulations requiring small improvements in fuel efficiency or emissions that were often discussed with the industry and sort of facilitated a path of small step, gradual sustaining innovation instead of more transitions. So I would like to discuss another option of putting regulations in this sector, which tries to take into account these interaction effects, because often it seems as if these interactions effects, so regulation trying to promote the one technology, but in fact the sector ending up with success of another, seems not to be taken into account very well in the regulations that we've seen in the past 25 years. So on the one hand, it tries to be mindful about those interactions. It tries to work with a dialogue of the key stakeholders in a sector, and it thinks about policies based on scenario analysis in the sector. So the first element of such a dynamic policy perspective would be a sort of platform, a low-carbon platform, which would be a multi-stakeholder platform that have been mentioned earlier in this room, to consult the government, with the government being one of the stakeholders in the room. So the goal of such a platform would be to develop a vision and a pathways towards an end vision for sustainable car mobility, which would not just be about emissions, but also be about jobs and the economic implications of certain regulation. So, yeah, as I will show, it will think about and discuss the niche regime dynamics in the room, and potentially for bigger issues there can be not just one platform but sub-platforms. There's an example in the Netherlands that I will show later. So I'm not thinking about a platform on a certain level, but I think they can be on various governance levels in that sense. So it can be on local and on national and supranational level. In Maastricht, for example, there has been a local platform about a CO2 neutral Maastricht in 2030. And on a national level in the Netherlands, there has been an energy transition group, so to speak, with many stakeholders around the table discussing a Dutch energy system which with a growing share of renewable energies. So the goal of the platform would be to consult stakeholders. So I would suggest not to introduce a new layer of decision making, but it would be next to the existing decision making units on local, national and supranational level, but it would be a continuous place to consult the stakeholders, and more than just interviewing them one by one, it would be a place to let them talk to each other as well, to let them make their perspective on the issue explicit. So understanding the different perspectives of the stakeholders would be a goal in itself. And through that, and through the talk, would be a vehicle for social learning of the related stakeholders. And next to that, there would be an input from scientists explaining and also studying the interactions in the sector, partly from the behavior and the different behaviors and the different perspectives of the related stakeholders, but also from economic effects, from other more ecological effects and impacts of the sector. So in terms of, so basically it's an idea to put this scientific studies on the table with the stakeholder dialogues. And the scientific input would then consist of integrated models, so which look at environmental, economic and social effects in relation to each other, which can be conceptual models as a vehicle for communication, but it can also be supported by computer simulation. And they would also deliver different possible scenarios of the sector. So scenarios, I think, have not been mentioned much yet, I think, in the last 2 days. But for sustainability issues, they can be an excellent way of putting the current issue in the longer time perspective in order to look beyond the current stakes and the current often lock-in and difference in interests. Speaking about 2030 with each other is less threatening than speaking about next year. And these models can help to research and map out these different scenarios, so possible futures, in a much more structured and coherent manner. So this is an example of a study we did on the automotive sector, which tries to understand techno-economic processes of more investment, more learning, more product improvement of established technologies, and the disadvantage of new technologies in that respect. Next to the influence of regulation, of resource use of various options, and also of different consumer perspectives on car use. So that means that that we can understand when, well, there have been, for example, in Europe, from enthusiasm from time to hydrogen vehicles, especially after 2000. There has been a platform for hydrogen vehicles also. But when that platform only looks at the promotion of hydrogen, the interactions with the established technology is overseen, and then you'll end up with, then you will miss very important interactions in the sector, and that can give great disappointments later on. So such a model can contain different consumer perspectives, because often also the consumer is seen as a sort of homogeneous group, everybody thinking the same about cars. But in practice, there are different types of consumers which react differently to regulation, which react differently to new engine technologies. And such effects can be anticipated when they are more systematically studied and also included in model analysis and scenario analysis. And they can be also included in the discussion among firms, and not to be naive about people being in favor of greener cars, because everybody is in favor of greener cars if you ask them through a questionnaire. But in fact, you can see that the large majority of the car consumers is reacting in a different way if you look to what they actually buy. So different scenarios can be sketched with or without the help of models. This was an analysis that sketched, for example, the transition scenario, where the amount of electric vehicles would be gradually growing over time, a growing market niche, or where, and the model can also simulate that, where an initial introduction of the and use of the electric vehicle is triggers a reaction of the established regime, which then later outcompetes electric vehicles again. So that is a model that takes into account these different types of consumers. So such scenario, I think, can help also in the discussion of such a platform in order to discuss what we spoke about revolution earlier on, or in this language we would say transition, because obviously that has an impact on the current on the current car manufacturers. So car manufacturers on a European level would be included in such a platform, and you could honestly look at these different types of scenarios and to what extent the greening of the car use would indeed be a threat to the business model of firms, and what how these things, how there are scenarios that are most attractive in terms both of the industry of the European car firms and of the emissions. So there's obviously the question that was posed earlier on who needs to be in and who needs to be out in the platform.
Okay, just time is over, so.
Okay, yeah, it's almost done. So this is a simple grid that students of us use when they do practical assessments with stakeholders. So looking to the level of interest and the level of power, and initially only on a preliminary analysis start talking to the key players, and when talking to the key players, asking them who are the most powerful and most interested stakeholders. So then typically in such a platform you wouldn't like too many stakeholders, but only include a number of them. So in conclusion, our analysis sees that policies in Europe have facilitated sustaining innovation with a gradual adaptation of the established regime. They have not triggered or steered towards more fundamental changes in the sector. And they have not anticipated well on interactions effect in the sector. So often there is another technology that has been successful despite a lot of policies. And I discussed a possible dynamic policy perspective that tries to put a scientific analysis of these interactions effect in the room with a stakeholder dialogue on various levels. I think that can be done, which is consulting the governments which integrate environmental and economic or industry policy, and which think about policies relating to different scenarios in the future. So that can be also discussing adaptation of the scenarios over time, and also if this would happen, if this scenario would turn out to be mostly getting real, then this will be the policy reaction that we will do. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.